Jewel. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Monthly Mindset. I know that Heather always waits in anticipation. What is Chad going to say about me for this Monthly Mindset? But you guys, many of you already know Heather. She's unbelievable. She's really a great person. I've known her now for many years, and I trust her immensely to come and speak and teach to all of us and to pour into all of us. And this space is a safe place that is nothing to do with sales, nothing to do with real estate, but all about being human and being yourself. And you can just be at ease and listen and learn. And without further ado, Heather, it's all yours.
Awesome. I actually think I've met most of you that are on today, so I'll spare you the elevator speech for me. But I'm Heather Perucchi. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, which is a fancy term for I'm a licensed therapist. And one of my favorite things to do is to show up with you guys once a month and share with you something that's inspired me or challenged me sometimes, and bring it to your attention so that you can learn along with me. So I felt after last month that I had done some kind of heavy stuff with you guys. Like we had talked about things that were maybe more challenging or tougher. So I was intent this time on bringing something maybe a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more joyful. And so today we're talking about glimmers. If you have never heard this word before and you have no idea what it means, you are not alone. I had also never heard this word before. So I dove into the idea that we are going to review what we talked about last month in anticipation of learning what these are. So now with that air of mystery, I will share with you that last month we talked about what's called microstressors. In the world that we live in today, microstressors are everywhere. They are in our family life. They are in our work life. They are in our, I have to run 75 errands and I don't want to do any of them life. And the distinction that the folks who did all the research on microstressors wanted to make sure people understood is that microstressors are not the things that you categorically assume are stressing you out. These are things that are almost indistinguishable in our day-to-day. So one of the examples I gave last month is this is like having your phone up in a meeting or a training and seeing a text pop through from somebody with whom you have a relationship that would inspire you to look at that text. It could be good news, it could be not good news, but the microstressor is the distraction of the text message or the potential irritant of the text message that interrupts what you're doing. And then we consider, oh, it's not a big deal, I'll just text them later. But that microstressor has put a little divot in our brain. And sometimes those microstressors tend to build on one another and they create some internal chaos. And because we don't think they're a big deal, like, oh, it's not a big deal that this guy cut me off in traffic. Oh, it's not a big deal that I told myself last night that I would just put gas in the car in the morning, which I know is a very consistent stressor for anyone, because you nevertheless are going to be running late the next morning. And then now you have to put gas in the car because you won't get where you're going unless you fill up your tank. So microstressors go relatively unnoticed because we tend to assume that they are not a big deal, that they are just things that we have to sort of deal with or manage, but we don't think about dealing with them. They're often part of a more subconscious or unconscious part of our day-to-day. So they seem routine. They seem like it's not a big deal. Maybe you work with a coworker whose personality is not aligned with yours. And every time that person comes to you, you groan a little bit on the inside. Maybe you have a boss that you don't see eye to eye with, or you're disagreeing with on a project. And every time you meet with them, the two of you are at odds. They don't necessarily seem like a big deal, but over time, they become this powder keg. It's almost like you're shoving all the gunpowder into the keg, and one day it's going to explode. And most likely, they found from research, it's going to explode in a completely inappropriate way. You're going to blow up at your spouse. You're going to blow up at your sister. You're going to blow up at a coworker who had nothing to do with any of the microstressors before. So when we talked about these, we really stressed that microstressors impact all areas of our lives, but they also come from all areas of our lives. So these are things that we just think we have to deal with on a regular basis, even though they're really impactful in our decision making, in our relationships, and they impact things like our capacity for making decisions, our integrity when the micro stressor is related to a decision making process that, we're not in alignment on, our emotional reserves. So after we ended micro stressors last month, I was like, I got to give these folks something sparkly, something really exciting to talk about, something joyful. So insert an antidote for micro stressors. And when I started to sort of research this, I found that Deb Dana is a licensed clinical social worker. That's what LCSW stands for. She wrote a book called The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy. I am not going to try and explain to you what polyvagal theory is because it's actually pretty nuanced. But essentially, she looked at how our internal systems and our external systems require intervention to be able to exist in harmony. So she dove deep into the idea of how we handle stressors is actually quite controllable. So glimmers is the term that she came up with. I don't know that that's the term I would have come up with, but we're going to run with it because it does sound very sparkly and shiny and, like you're going to paint it on your ceiling or something. So anyway, insert the antidote for micro stressors, which is glimmers. So when she started doing her research and she started to look at the big picture of why she needed to look at this, one of the things that she studied was people who are positive versus people who are negative. So I know I don't usually ask you or force you to interact in the chat box, but I would love to know, before we get into what glimmers are, do you consider yourself a primarily positive human, or do you consider yourself a primarily negative human? i.e., do you consider yourself more of an optimist, or do you consider yourself more of a pessimist? And there's no right answer. It just is what it is. So thank you, Steve. I feel like we tend to give answers in this based on what we think the person teaching wants to hear. But I do think that there is a place in the world for both optimists and pessimists, and they both provide value. So thank you for your feedback. Looks like most of you consider yourself on the optimist side of the scale. So what she found was people who considered themselves optimists tended to allow micro stressors to impact them more. Because, I like the distinction, Jewel, realist and pessimist. I do think realist is more in the middle of the spectrum, but we can certainly talk about that. Both, depending. My favorite therapist answer is, well, it depends. So what she found in her study was folks who thought they were optimists tended to allow more micro stressors to come into their lives, which is interesting because we think as optimists that stuff doesn't impact us. But what ended up happening was folks who were optimists thought this doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. It doesn't impact me. But the reality was it absolutely was impacting them. And so as an antidote, she started to talk about, well, what's the opposite of a trigger? Like what's the thing that's going to seemingly even out or equal out a trigger? So if you're triggered by people who are rude by cutting in line, or people who are rude by interrupting you, or people who cut you off in traffic, what do we do to counteract that? So her study really leaned into curiosity about humanity, but she knew that was too big of a picture. So she wanted to hone in on, if I experience micro stressors on a regular basis and the big coping skills like therapy, journaling, exercise, all that stuff, if that stuff feels too big, what can I do that's smaller but still impactful? And what she found was glimmers are small moments where our biology is in a place of connection and regulation, which cues our nervous system to feel safe or calm. You can put a pin in that because we're going to talk about that a little bit more. There's about 17 pieces of that sentence that need to be broken down a little bit. But the short answer is she wanted to find a way to inspire our brains to feel like the world is okay, just even for one tiny moment. So if you're in the midst of a stressor, in the midst of a tough time in your life, what are those small, tiny pieces of time that you can capture and use to eradicate a few of those micro stressors and maybe lessen the powder in the powder keg? So we're going to talk a little bit about this as defined. So this is like going to a therapist and having a therapist go, well, it sounds like the actions between you and like launching into a huge explanation about why you're experiencing some of the symptoms of anxiety. We are going to take this and we're going to break this down. So small moments where our biology is in a place of connection and regulation, which cues our nervous system to feel safe or calm, is essentially what we call emotional regulation. So this is a time in our day where we don't notice it, but we have a flicker of joy. This is like getting an email with somebody signing onto a contract. This is an accepted offer. This is your boss decides to buy lunch for the team. This is the sun is shining into the windows of my house. And for a moment, I feel like everything is okay in the world. And a lot of psychodynamic therapists, which is essentially therapists who use the collection of the 5 most common theoretical orientations in therapy, is called emotional regulation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be emotionally regulated. So we're going to eradicate that huge, complicated definition, and we're going to try to understand that this is how the world and we interact. This is how we understand and try to control the things that impact us. So emotional regulation is a relatively simple concept. It's the ability to exert control over our own emotional state. For me, one of my most difficult emotional regulations is when I go to funerals or to weddings. And I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I've had to go to funerals either with people or on my own for folks that I'm not super emotionally attached to, whether this is clients that my team members have lost or someone in the community, someone who I didn't have a significant relationship with. But when I go to a funeral, the minute I walk into whatever place the funeral is being held, I'm a mess. Like there's tears streaming down my face. I'm having a very physical reaction to something that doesn't really need to be impactful for me. Like I can be there in support of someone else without having a little bit of a breakdown. There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. But when I want to present myself in such a way that is appropriately reflecting how I feel about the situation, emotional regulation is that tool. So if we talk about how we emotionally regulate ourselves, it's an intention that we set to respond to the things that we experience with emotions that are socially tolerable. For those of you that know me, that have been showing up to Monthly Mindset on a regular basis or have worked with me, you know that I tell you all the time, you don't have to care what other people think. You really don't. But in a workplace, there are times when you have to be socially tolerable because you just don't have another choice. So the ability to emotionally regulate allows us to be flexible to the reactions that we are having and either delay them or halt them. So let's say you're at a work party and it's a joyful occasion because you're celebrating some amazing accomplishment that I know you all have every week, every month of every year, because you're all extraordinarily successful humans and you love to celebrate your hard work. So let's say that before the party, you had a fight with your partner. And you know that the socially tolerable or flexible emotion that you need to present with is joy at this party, whether your partner comes with you or not. You need to be joyful because that's the point of the party. But really on the inside, ooh, you're pissed. Like your partner decided they thought they were king or queen of the world and they came at you and how dare they? And you cannot stop that fire from bubbling all the way up into your throat. But you know that if you show up to this party and you're pissed, people are going to not only be distracted from the point of the party, but you're probably going to feel badly about having participated in that distraction. So emotional regulation is all about allowing ourselves to feel one way, but controlling the reaction that we have in the situation as it's deemed appropriate. So my favorite one, most of you know this, is pausing to collect your thoughts before responding. This works, and I dare you to challenge me on it, but this works in every single situation. If you pause to collect your thoughts before you respond to somebody or someone or a situation, it will never steer you wrong. I would love it if one of you wants to debate that with me, because that would be very exciting for my Friday morning. But I feel very strongly about the fact that pausing to collect yourself before responding is almost always the proper response. So when we think about how we do that, there's several ways. One of my favorites is wearing a rubber band around your wrist. And when you start to feel like something is heated, you just snap it. And it reminds yourself in a physical way that you don't have to play into whatever the situation is that's happening. You don't have to be angry. You don't have to yell. You don't have to storm down the hallway and go, I don't know what they were thinking. Why is this always happening? Throwing papers as you do. I promise you that that pause will help you regulate the way that you are experiencing that emotion. Robert, are you high-fiving me or are you asking a question?
No, I had a question. So how do you pause when a discussion's occurring, and if you don't speak, the other person or persons just keep talking? So, if you've ever gotten into a discussion where the other person just wants to talk and never really give you a chance to interject your thoughts. So what's a trick to do that in when you want to take a pause to collect, but the other person isn't recognizing your need for that pause? Am I making any
So
sense?
that's the beautiful, you make perfect sense. And I want to assure you, I've always had perfectly healthy and never emotional relationships during all of my workplace experiences. So of course, I've never had to use this tool because I've always had perfectly respectful conversations with everyone, right? Nobody's ever come at me for whatever reason. But you asked such a good question, because the tricky thing about using tools is you have to understand how to use them, and you have to understand where you interject them. So the first thing I'll tell you is that your need to interject that other person is often more about what you need to feel in that situation, such as heard or respected, than it is about the other person. When you're in a conversation with somebody who can't stop talking, it's one of two reasons. One, they think they're the only important opinion in the world, or two, they don't respect the person that they're having a conversation with. So sometimes you can let the desire to interject go until that person has excised all the wind out of their self. And the difficult thing about this is that that's all about controlling your own responses. Now, if you feel like what you have to say is imperative in that discussion that you're having right now, my suggestion is to use a respectful interjection. So what I generally use, like for example, in my therapy sessions, when my clients are going, and there's no space for me to say, I'll say something like, can we take a pause? I really want to address the things that you've talked about already. And I'm fearful that if I don't, I'm going to forget those things, and those things are important. Essentially, you are interrupting, which there are times when interrupting is just the way that it's got to be. But you're also trying to help diffuse the situation, because often when folks keep going, it's also escalating. That's kind of my experience. Maybe that's not always true for you guys, but often when people are like going, it's because they're getting more and more angry or frustrated or intolerant. So the use of interruption can be really effective because it can sometimes help to diffuse the situation. So to answer your question, there's two things. One, consider the importance of your interjection. Like, is it something that can wait until they've lost all their steam? Or is it something where you can say, excuse me, I know you're saying something really important, but I don't want to forget these things. So can we just pause for a second? And you may have to talk over, you may have to use a louder tone, but you can do that in a respectful way and still maintain the integrity of the conversation. If you'd like, I'll take it one step further. Let me take it one step further.
Sure, yeah,
Okay.
that's great.
So the one step further is to say, I think we're getting a little off topic here. I asked a question about this, and now we're talking about this. Can we go back to the conversation we were originally having? And we can address that at the next conversation we have. Worst case scenario, if you can't get out of it, say, you know what? I actually have a meeting. Turn around and walk away.
Thank you.
I love your question because it reminds me and everyone in this room that there are not always perfect solutions to the challenges that we face. Sometimes we have to like do messy stuff. So if you're in control of a situation and you can snap a rubber band and wait for a pause, then do that. But if you can't, utilize one of those tools, because in the situations that I think you're talking about, you're likely feeling disrespected or not seen or not heard. And that person is just taking the opportunity to soapbox. Any other thoughts on that? Such a good question.
It's kind of dramatic when I swing that microphone around, isn't it? You're like, any other
It
questions?
is. I
No, I just want to say, I mean, it's related, unrelated, but interestingly, and it's funny because I learned this in law school nonetheless, and Robert went to law school too, but like they kind of they do a lot of like teaching how to like debate and converse and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I took away is trying not to. There's sometimes when people have conversations with you, they're already teeing up what they're saying, and then it becomes a battle of ego and pride and stubbornness because both people are cutting each other. No one's hearing anything. I really try, and it takes a lot of work, but I really, really try not to plan what my rebuttal or remark or comment is or anything. I literally try to just stop thinking so I can just be listening, because I'm trying to mirror for them how I want them to discuss with me. And it does work a lot of the time, not always, but it does work a lot of times, especially if they see me, if they notice that they're continually interrupting me, I'll go, okay, continue, please. And after like the third or fourth time, they realize like they're stepping on me when I'm trying to give them the floor. So I'd appreciate it in return. And more often than not, it works. And if it doesn't, then I just go, I need to take a break because I'm not able to, you're not allowing me to speak. So when we want to have like a normal interaction, then we can have a conversation.
Yeah. You make such a good point, and I'm 100% confident that in your guys' coaching, you talk about the difference between listening to reply and listening to understand. So when you're in a conversation, if you're already planning the next thing that you're going to say, you can almost guarantee that you're not listening to what the other person has said for content or for understanding. So you bring up a really important thing that we talk a lot about in my communications training, which is understanding that there's two parties in a conversation, even if one of you is giving the directive. So even in, boss employee conversations, the onus lies on the boss to be able to model or mirror for someone the way that we have a respectful conversation. It's not on the employee. The employee is learning. So while the direction or the intervention may not be exciting or feel very good, it's still a conversation that can have as respectful and kind an outcome as possible. Mind you, there are literally exceptions to every single rule in the world, but for the majority of time, we're trying to have interactions that are beneficial for both parties. So the boss is learning from the employee, and the employee is definitely learning from the boss. Robert, I'll say one other thing. This happens a lot in couples because usually when there is deep rooted or deep seated dissension, both parties want to be right. Like they want to be the one that sort of wins the conflict. And one of the toughest things that couples go through is learning how to pause and listen to their partner, not because they're listening to debate it or to be right, but they're listening to be invested in the relationship. So I often tell people in my like coaching or sort of like high achieving therapy, you don't have to exert your authority. You already have it. What does it look like for you to be in relationship or in connection with that person, even if you disagree with them or you don't particularly enjoy their personality? So that pause, that ability to emotionally regulate, it creates opportunities for people to have more open conversations as opposed to conversations in which they're like logistically compromising. Like, okay, fine, if you do the dishes, I'll do this, but I don't like it. So it opens an evolution of maturity in our connections where we can get past the tit for tat type of arguments that we often have. That pause can help. And emotional regulation is something that us as humans don't always do well. This is why we have such vast amounts of coaching and therapy and things like that that are about how do I have appropriate reactions based on the situation or the environment that I'm in. So when you do these interventions or you practice this on your own, these are kind of the 4 main things that you can try. If you're in a situation that's heavy or angry or frustrated, what's the tiny little glimmer that you can pull from that creates some calmness? What's the tiny little hope that you can hang on to that helps decide to hide your fear or your sadness? And emotional regulation is an ongoing tool that we really try to use as often as possible in an as natural way possible as well, because we want it to feel like it's naturally occurring in our connections with other people. Any other thoughts on emotional regulation or this slide? So back to the topic. We're talking about glimmers. Glimmers are recognizing small positive moments over and over again to begin to reshape our internal system. I really enjoy this picture of this woman laying in her backyard because my first thought was, why doesn't she have a towel underneath her? Because I'm sure that grass is very scratchy. And I hope she's wearing sunscreen because it looks like the sun's out. But the intention of the picture is she's taking a moment to close her eyes, to take a deep breath, most likely 3 or 4, and to feel the sun on her face, and to try and re-regulate her nervous system so that her nervous system can come from a place of positivity or hope, as opposed to a place of defensiveness or anger. As we've evolved as humans, one of the more unfortunate things that's happened is our minds are tending towards defensiveness or looking for the potential for things to go sideways. We tend to look for the disruption. We tend to look for the way somebody's trying to sneak something into a contract and know they're not going to get the best of us. We tend to think that our spouse is only out to get what they want and not provide for what we want. So as we've evolved as communities and as we've become this sort of like instant gratification, instant needs met community and society, our brains have followed suit. We want it to be fixed right now. We want it to be happy right now. But the only reason we're doing that, or only way we're doing that, is by recognizing the things that we might have to defend ourselves from. So this study on Glimmers was really about shifting that to recognizing the really good things or the bright side of things. Mind you, I've talked to you guys several times about toxic positivity. This is not about always finding the silver lining, because sometimes things just suck and we have to recognize that. But the benefit of shifting from automatic defensiveness to automatic inclusion is a jolt to our mental health. It helps to create a safety net around our ability to positively interact with ourselves and each other, we have an increase in the dopamine effects of our mental health as opposed to the defensive. So glimmers are small positive moments over and over again, recognized intentionally to help reframe our thinking and help us come from a place of less defensiveness and more intention. So what do? Well, there's lots of things we can do. You can hire a coach to help you do this. You can reach out to a therapist and say, I've been experiencing some really difficult stuff in my life. I'm feeling very stressed out and very overwhelmed. I need you to help me practice finding glimmers in my day to day. Likely you would get more benefit out of therapy than just that. That's my conjecture. But if you're not ready to do that kind of thing, here's some simple things that you can do. One, recognize that your uncomfortable emotions are not always necessary to sit in. They are necessary to sit in sometimes. And you guys have heard me say this over and over again. Sometimes you got to sit in it before you can move through it. But if you're feeling uncomfortable all the time, we need to start to look for other ways to improve your overall mental and emotional health. My favorite way to do that is to take a break. Shared with you guys that my go-to is scheduling at least a half an hour between my sessions so that I can like take my dogs for a quick walk, or I can stand and have some sunshine on my face. Because if I do 8 sessions in a row with a 5-minute break in between them, I'm no good to 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 because I'm only halfway there. So if we learn how to put these small breaks into our day-to-day, it will help us recognize those glimmers. You get a really kind text from a friend. You have the time to walk to the coffee shop and get your favorite latte of the day. You get to go run an errand for pleasure in the middle of your day, and it brings you joy to go buy a gift for someone. So take a little break, create that time, and intentionally look for the things that make you happy. The sun, the sound of the waves, somebody walking their dog. And then I couldn't find a better picture of sprinkles, but like add a little sprinkle of it. Like instead of just recognizing it, tell yourself like, that was really lovely. Like that walk in the middle of the day really shifted me away from whatever I was angry about. And recognize that our uncomfortable emotions are not always teaching us something. Sometimes they're just existing. So if you take a break and you recognize something that brings you a little sprinkle of joy, the by effect of that is as your emotions go down, your logic tends to go up. So instead of making emotionally reactive or defensive comments or decisions, you tend to take things from a more logical approach and consider all of the things that are impacting your decision. So rather than being angry at your client because they just won't agree to whatever it is that you're wanting them to agree to, you have the ability to say like, oh, maybe they're afraid, or maybe they're feeling overwhelmed, or maybe they're feeling pushed into this decision. So as you take some of that uncomfortable emotion away, you can then put a little bit more rational and logical thinking in front. I know sometimes you guys don't necessarily have the time to do this because your days are busy. But the whole point of Glimmers is to recognize those tiny, like very quick things. So as you recognize those, your ability to logically handle situations definitely goes up. I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that glimmers are not the solution to every single thing that you deal with in your life. Like finding the sunshine in the middle of the day is not going to be the answer to dealing with family trauma or dealing with a partner who's disrespectful or abusive to you. So if you have an extensive history of negativity or trauma or feeling challenged, it's probably time to partner with somebody who can help you work through that. And so just like toxic positivity or finding the silver lining in every single situation is not the most beneficial thing for you guys, glimmers are not the solution for dealing with being treated poorly by people in your life. So if you are feeling saturated by negativity, you're having difficulty in most areas of your life, I really would suggest and encourage you to at least talk to somebody about all of it. Because one of the most beneficial things that coaches or therapists can do is be able to take in all of your information and give you a really unbiased thought about it, such as, well, it sounds like you got a lot of really negative people in your life. What does it look like to have a positive interaction? So again, if you're dealing with really heavy stuff, probably Glimmers is not the answer. Can help with some of the symptoms, but it's not the solution. Secondly, like I feel like you got to look at whether or not you feel like you're capable or able to emotionally regulate. Like, do you feel like you can take a really difficult situation and flip into a not so difficult situation, allow that to be difficult and not feel inauthentic or fake, but hold that at bay until you can actually deal with it? Do you feel like you have that ability? If you don't, time to start practicing. If you do, then set some small expectations for yourself. Like, make the stuff that you want to accomplish or do, the things that you really want to get better at, make them small so that you can win at them. Like, what's the last small expectation that you set for yourself? I have huge goals, but like, what's the last like small thing that you did for yourself or that you set for yourself? Can you even think of one?
Last one
Like,
I
is
had was
there one?
participating in this.
Ah, such a good example. Thank you. I both feel honored and proud at the same time.
It's
Honored
just,
that you would consider this.
yeah, it's just nice to do something for myself, you know, and I don't do a lot of that. So this sort of thing I don't do much of, but I like it. It makes me think and kind of forget about the other stuff. So
Yeah. Wonderful. I feel honored that you said that. Thank you. Anybody else have a small expectation they've set? It doesn't even have to be accomplished, but small expectation.
To get enough sleep. 7 hours.
7. 7's like
Yes.
your sweet spot.
At minimum that I need.
I love that expectation. I also love sleeping. So I'm proud of you for setting that expectation, because sleeping is the number one thing that you can do to restore your system from a physical and emotional, a mental health, a wellness, a not being cranky with the people you're around. Sleeping is a wonderful one. Of course, the morning gym routine counts, Jewel. And the way that you make that a small expectation is you set it as an expectation for the next day, right? Like, tomorrow morning, I'm going to go to the gym because I'm prioritizing myself. It doesn't have to be I'm going to work out every day for the next 25 days. It can be tomorrow I'm going. My small expectation for myself is I have to go to 2 like kind of annoying appointments today. You know, like I have to go to the dentist. That's like not my favorite thing to do. So my expectation for finding the little glimmer of hope in it is I'm going to take myself out for lunch. Because if I have to go to the dentist, I might as well get some yummy lunch out of it, right? Now, it could end up being Lani Kai juice or something, but if I have to go do that, then I'm going to do this. That's my small expectation for myself. Any other inspirations for small expectations? Thank you for sharing those, guys. I appreciate it. So let's make cookies out of all of these glimmers, micro stressors, emotional regulation tips that we have talked about today. My personal favorite is sugar cookies with sprinkles. You can choose whatever cookie you'd like to make. But if we mix it all together, the first thing that we do is recognize that our nervous system is searching for pretty consistently, kind of like your server or the, CPU, like it's kind of running all day long. our nervous system is looking for clues or things that signify we're potentially in danger. And one of the things that Glimmers help us do is remind our nervous system that not everything is a potential danger. So the more worried, fearful, anxious, defensive we are, the more likely our nervous system is to search for things that are going to perpetuate that. So it isn't that you have to be happy all the time. It's definitely not it. But when we start to look at our ability to emotionally regulate, we start to retrain our nervous system to stop assuming that everything is a potential danger. And it starts to look for things that really bring us joy. And I don't know about you guys, maybe this is harder for you guys because you spend a lot of time in your car, but I love driving and I don't have a ton of opportunities to drive anymore. And sometimes driving in Hawaii can be really stressful. So when I get in the car and drive somewhere, I like to put all the windows down. I like to play my favorite music. I find it a really tiny, joyful experience. But when I first moved here, I was nervous all the time about driving in Hawaii because it's kind of crazy. So I had to retrain my nervous system to stop assuming that driving was going to be stressful. And I started to make it something that was actually quite enjoyable. I don't need to worry about parking. I don't need to worry about other drivers. Well, I mean, you do, but I can make the experience as joyful as possible. So I had to retrain this part of my brain that assumed everything bad happens when you drive. I've been pretty successful at it. I think as we really intentionally set ourselves on a path of learning how to regulate the way that we feel, those glimmers become much more powerful. So they're still small, but they become more impactful. And one of my favorite ways to look at progress and to talk about doing things well is to document them or journal them. Journaling is one of my favorite activities. I'm not super consistent with it, but it is one of those ways where I feel like we can look back and recognize how far we've come in our practices. So if we track things like totally ran into a friend when I was out running an errand today, or had the most delicious salad for lunch today, or had a shake this morning that was the perfect ratio of every ingredient and it tasted amazing. If we can track those sorts of things, whether you pop it in your notes app, whether you get a journaling app, whether you use a checklist, it can be really effective in reminding our brain of how far we've come from what we were struggling with prior. So as we sort of mix all these ideas glimmers together, we want to make sure, one, that we're not trying to upheave our whole life and do everything all at once, but we're going to start to set an intention to recognize these things that are impactful on the day-to-day. Like maybe you see somebody with a brand new puppy on the street and you smile and think like, oh, so fun. It's so cool to have a new puppy, instead of going, oh my God, I bet that puppy's peeing all over the house. Like, let's let it be a cute new addition to somebody's family. You don't got to think about the other stuff. So as you recognize them, as you remind your nervous system that not everything is dangerous, and you track these things, you tend to come to a place of where you utilize it on a more regular basis. So we're going to do a little tiny activity before we say goodbye, but I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to picture a time where you have felt peaceful. And as you think about where you are and who you're with, I want you to recognize who's there. How old are you? Is this a piece from childhood? Is this yesterday? Is this a situation where you felt really accomplished? Is this when someone extended you a kindness? What does that picture look like? Okay, open your eyes. You're welcome to share it if you'd like. But the reason I put this in today is because you now have one of the number one emotionally regulating tools that you can use in your back pocket. And you've just proven that you can do it because you did it with me. So anytime you're feeling some kind of way, this is the most effective thing that you can do. Close your eyes, picture a moment, capture that moment. Who am I with? How old am I? It will instantaneously calm your nervous system down. And then as you start to practice that more often, you can have go-tos where, Robert, when you're in one of those conversations, you don't even have to close your eyes, but you can see that last time you felt peace, and it will instantaneously bring the stress of your nervous system down. So I want you guys to know that part of doing this research was self-serving, because I actually feel less anxious though when I started doing this research. So I want to thank you for inspiring me to do something that was on a different path than some of the heavier stuff that we've done. But now I want to impart on you that the same way that micro stressors add up and create powder kegs and explosions, so do glimmers. The more that you notice, the more that you see, the more that you take a deep breath, the more that you close your eyes and picture, the less your powder keg is gonna catch. Because while the micro stressors still exist, they're less impactful for you because you're almost antidoting or counteracting them. So in the same way the negative stuff feels like it's piling up, the positives can feel like it's piling up too. I'm very excited to hear any thoughts that you all might have. Did we like the shift to the less heavy topic? Do you have questions? Do you have thoughts?
For me, I'll say for me, it wasn't less or more heavy. All your stuff is very thought provoking. So if you kind of just sit in it and take the nuggets out of it, they're all, you know what I mean? I haven't found anyway, I don't want to speak for anyone else too, but it's not heavy, but really just like, that's interesting, the different ways to think about it, and some tools, right, to work with. So that's great.
Thank you.
I agree with Chad. I'm not trying to, kiss up or anything, but I find it very thought provoking, the topic, and I like that you give tools to try to learn from it.
Thank you, Robert. Okay. Well, oops, I hit back too soon. I just, in the spirit of small accomplishments that may not feel huge, I want you guys to know that my website for my therapy and coaching is finally up at the bottom of the slide. We have finally, after 4 months of it being on my to-do list, and I do want you guys to know that it took about 45 minutes. So the 3 months of not wanting to do it and putting it off took me about 45 minutes to finish it. So if you want to go check it out, you can. It just talks about my therapy practice and my coaching, but I'm taking the opportunity in full transparency to say sometimes my stuff is just as the way it is, your guys' is. So just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean I have all the answers, but I'm very proud of my little website. And yeah, so any other thoughts? Any topics you want me to research? You guys are always welcome to email me and tell me, hey, please, can you take a look at this topic?
We briefly touched, I don't know if you can, or if it's possible, but you and I briefly touched on it.
No, please tell me your idea.
Is and for a lot of reasons. This one's a deep dive because there's just so much to it, but it's like maybe a 101 versus a PhD level of identifying narcissistic traits in those around us. And the reason I say that, I guess the head nodding is a good thing, but the reason I say that is because couple of things. I think that they exist abundantly and people might not realize it. And that's number one. Number two is I also think that it's a cliche that can be overused. So people just throw that out like, well, that person's a narcissist. And, I think it's a little irresponsible without knowing, well, what does it really mean and how, that sort of thing.
You have nodding votes and you have chat votes. So full disclosure, I love this topic and despise it all at the same time, because you are correct, right? That with the evolution of humanity, it does exist more abundantly than it used to, or we recognize it now more than we ever have before. So I'll give you an example that one of my clients actually gave me was they watched Mad Men, and they realized that in the 50s, narcissism was abundant. But in the 50s, that behavior was much more accepted, socially acceptable, and tolerated, and now less, because we've evolved in the way that we exist as a humanity and as a community. But there are times, like TikTok comes to mind, Instagram comes to mind. There are times when it becomes way too all-consuming, and then everything fits into it. So if somebody's mean to you and all of a sudden they're a narcissist, like, well, that's not quite how it works. So I appreciate your bravery in asking. I have been playing with the idea of this topic for several months. So now I feel challenged and driven to create at least a 101. I like the idea of doing a 101 because you guys know me, like I want to give you as deep as I possibly can so that you can think about it as much as possible. But I like the idea of kind of a 101.
Because can I say, interestingly, I'm not going to mention any names, obviously, but I recently came across the term covert narcissist, quiet narcissist, which I had never heard of before, which clearly is a distinction between what everyone kind of puts into the bucket of narcissist or overt narcissist. So I recently read a book about it, and I was like, wow, this topic is really, really interesting. And then it's like unplugging from the matrix. You're like, I think that person's a narcissist, that person's a narcissist. then it goes down to a rabbit hole, but it is a really, really interesting topic.
Heather, I have a question over here too. This
please.
is Steve Bond. Yeah, narcissism and the greater topic of psychopaths, sociopaths. I'm not anywhere near a licensed clinical social worker, and so the definitions of these different behavioral types, to sort of address it perhaps in one of these Friday meetings of, are there differences? Which ones are the more predominant out there, or the most destructive and negatively impactful on our lives? Anyway, Chad, thank you for bringing it up, because it's just something that I've experienced, and getting more clarity without going down the rabbit hole. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Maybe we make a series out of it, actually. Please.
Can I add a request? So I'm also not a licensed therapist, but most of it goes to lack of empathy. So basically detecting in early stages the lack of empathy, if you can give us some tips, and also on setting boundaries around those people.
We did a monthly mindset on boundaries, and it was very thought-provoking and inspired a lot of conversation. I actually got several text messages afterwards. So it's probably time to revisit that one. So thank you for reminding me that we did that. But empathy is also kind of a big topic that we're doing right now along the lines of narcissism, because we want to understand, like, can it be taught? Like, can you learn the traits of empathy? And it's not a yes or no answer, spoiler, but these are things that people are curious about and want to understand so that they can both protect themselves, but also understand other people's behavior from a different lens. So I certainly appreciate the idea. And now I'm cooking up a series in my brain. So get ready, people. 3-part series coming. Any other thoughts or suggestions? Thank you, guys. Awesome. Well, please, as always, you're welcome to text me or email me if you have questions or thoughts, or you'd like me to cover something. Again, I appreciate all of you showing up and spending time with me. Robert, I also look forward to Monthly Mindset every month. So I'm very grateful that you do as well. and go out and find your glimmers. That's your challenge for today.